Right, and so now part D of the lecture, just on the notion of critique, and presumably I'll say some things in here that might get a bit of debate going. I guess when people think of critical thinking, they initially think of, people being negative all the time. So I suppose the first distinction to make is that critical thinking is about reasonable, reflective thinking about issues, questioning your assumptions and assessing evidence, not just being cynical about everything. And the first distinction I made earlier between description, explanation and theory is an important starting point for realising that there's more going on than just being able to describe, just saying Joe Bloggs said this or such and such a textbook said that. We want you to apply those things and say, how does this illuminate this person's life? And then as you think more about the kinds of explanations you might want to use to explain things in society, you'll see that there are broader theoretical patterns or paradigms that can then be generalised to other situations, but also begin to think systematically through the assumptions that you make as you're doing the analysis. It's about thinking systematically. It's about seeing the big picture and understanding that the world is a process, an ongoing process rather than a collection of things. It involves putting yourself in the position of others. I think that's an important skill that you learn from critical thinking and from sociology, and there's a couple of examples which I've put on the part of the website, resources part of the website. Willis' discussion of the sociological imagination talks about taking an anthropological perspective, so rather than thinking about that in terms of being an anthropologist studying tribal people, it's about taking that position of the other and learning to see the world through other people's eyes. And so there's a couple of examples there. Barbecue area is really nice reverse ethnography. So what would the world look like if Indigenous people had settled a white Australia, and the sorts of things that white people are inclined to say, but flipping the process over. You also get a good look at the anthropologist's gaze or the ethnographer's gaze because of the parody that's involved. The sort of style that anthropologists and ethnographers use. When it's flipped over, the power relations and the assumptions are much clearer. Black Like Me was a book reading from last year's book reading in ABC, and they read Black Like Me. Now that's a famous case where a guy takes a drug that makes his skin dark, goes through the South as a black man. He's a journalist and professor at a university there. So he talks about his experience of being the other, and Blue Eyed is the other one. It's a famous workshop series, where people are a scenario is created where people with blue eyes are made to take positions of inferiority, and she explores how that works as a consciousness raising exercise. And in sociology, critical thinking is about how we could change the situation or improve the situation. So based on the analysis that we do with history, structure, culture, what does that tell us about the sorts of changes that need to happen? We talked about these key terms earlier, but I think it's important to start clarifying some of these words, particularly as they have a different usage in common sense terms, in everyday use in society, than what we want to use them in science and social science. When I say I have a hypothesis if I were to use that word in everyday conversation, I mean something like a guess, maybe an educated guess. But in science we mean a proposed explanation that we plan to test. A hypothesis is an explanation that we're going to test. It's not just a guess. And so likewise, theory tends to mean hypothesis in everyday language. If I say I have a theory, I mean I have an explanation, a proposed explanation, or maybe it is just a guess, but we use this word theory very loosely. Whereas in social science we want to say it's a generalised explanation, a way of connecting a whole bunch of data together, and it's been tested. The important thing to understand about a theory is that it's intended to explain the data. So it's wrong in that sense to say that something is just a theory, because that relies on the common sense use of the word theory as a proposed explanation, as if it hasn't been tested and subject to revision. and used across a whole range of scenarios to try to make a case that this explanation is a good one. So to say that it's just a theory implies that it's an educated guess. And just to make that a bit clearer, some classic debates about theories of global warming or theories of evolution, and people say, well, it's just a theory, implying that somehow, what does it really mean? When you say it's just a theory, you mean it could be different, there could be a better explanation. Usually that's some sort of creationist explanation. So let's just try to break it down. The evidence, in a nutshell, because we don't have all day, is to look at a diagram like the one on this slide and say, over time, as best as we can figure out, these are the time frames that we're talking about, billions of years. In the fossil record, we find that things go from simple to complex. So for billions of years, just single-celled organisms, then algae. About 500 million years ago, we begin to get more complicated fish, invertebrates, then fish, then amphibians, then reptiles, then mammals, and so we get this move to complexity through time. It's important to understand what we're trying to do with the theory of evolution is to explain that. How do we explain that data? The theory of evolution says there are processes of natural selection by which animals in different environments are led to be more likely to survive and to reproduce. So there's a range of variations in a population, and some of those will allow the animal to survive better and some will not. And those that are led to survive better will be more likely to breed, and over time the population shifts in the direction of those characteristics. But I'm assuming you know the theory of evolution well enough to know that we didn't evolve from apes, but I suppose I should make that clear. Animals evolve from common ancestors. So we share a common ancestor with various kinds of apes, and chimpanzees also share that common ancestor, but we didn't evolve from them. If we went back 4 generations in my family, we might find that somewhere in there you and I are cousins. But it doesn't mean that I didn't evolve from you. You're a different creature we have a common ancestor in, further back in time. So all animals have a common ancestor going back ultimately to these single-celled creatures, right? But over time they divide, and we can look at the genetics. It's also supported by evidence from a range of sciences. So it isn't just about saying, oh well, the biologists say this. There's genetic evidence, there's evidence in the way that fetuses evolve, mature in the womb. Some of the argument is that radiocarbon dating is incorrect and doesn't provide accurate dates. Now, of course, we're talking about billions of years, so the error factor can be big if you're trying to make very precise measurements. But if carbon dating is wrong, then our theory of how atoms work is wrong. Our physics is wrong because it works on the radioactive decay of carbon over time. And if we're wrong in those dates about the way carbon decays over time, then our understanding of basic physics is wrong. So it would have, if these things were proved wrong, it would have repercussions across a whole range of sciences. Alternative explanations to evolution need to come up with better explanations of that pattern. That's what they're trying to do. They need to cite evidence and argument. Now that could mean explaining why evolutionary theories are wrong, or have got some aspects of it wrong, or don't explain the evidence that we have. But in essence, creationism says that this pattern is a result of special creation by a supernatural being. Now that's not a scientific explanation. What evidence does it cite? Essentially, creationism says that the evidence is biblical, that the Bible says that the earth was created in 7 days or 7,000 years or some variation of that. Of course, there are many versions of creationism, but essentially it says a supernatural being created it, which would mean it wasn't science, and the evidence it cites are ancient biblical writings from the 10th century BC onward. So we know those writings came together in about 500 BC. They've been edited and worked on out of very ancient oral traditions going back to ancient Egypt, and that's essentially what's being used as evidence for a creationist argument. Now, you can then make the assessment of that evidence, you can have a debate about it, but it's important to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about what a theory is and what it's trying to do. So creationism is entitled to express itself as a theory. I don't think it's scientific because it doesn't rely on material causes. But even if we were prepared to accept that as an explanation, is it possible that a divine super being created this pattern? Of course it is. What evidence do we have for that? The only evidence we have is an ancient set of writings by Jewish tribespeople, which most people would not accept as legitimate evidence. Now, I don't think that science and religion have to be competitors in that way, but that's just to give you the idea that when you say something is just a theory, you need to be clear about what it is you're talking about. These are some other key terms. What do we mean when we say we know something? In philosophy, we don't do a whole course in philosophy, but usually knowledge is defined as something like a justified true belief. So for something to be knowledge, we have to have three criteria. We have to believe it's true. You have to believe that the Earth goes around the Sun for the heliocentric universe to be a piece of knowledge. It has to be true, that is, the Earth does in fact have to go around the Sun, and you have to believe it. And it has to be justified. You have to have evidence or good reasons to justify the claim. So it's got to be a justified true belief. And often in arguments and discussions we find ourselves talking with people who say unusual sorts of things about that constellation. So one of them is that things are true for me. It's true for me. Now this is really just a way of saying they believe it, so that's really just the belief part. But they use the word true to try to buttress their claim, because truth compels belief. It doesn't make sense to say that you think something is true but you don't believe it. So to say something is true for me means that you believe it. Doesn't add anything to say something. If something is true, it's true for everybody, not in the example of the sun going around the Earth going around the sun. Then if that is true, then it isn't just true for you, it's true for everybody. Another way that people talk about things is valid, that something is a valid argument. Now this is another way of saying you think it's true, but it's important just to be clear that in argument, valid means it follows from the premises that you hold. So if an argument is valid, then it means that it follows from the argument. So you could say that if the moon was made of green cheese, then mice could live there. Because you're saying, if that were true, then the mice could live there. That's valid. That would be a valid conclusion. But of course the question then is, to make something true, is whether the moon is made of green cheese. So that's nothing to do with the truth statement. So validity and truth are slightly different things. Another one is negative arguments, and this one comes up most often in arguments about the existence of God and about atheism and so on. That people insist that because a person can't prove that it isn't the case, that therefore it might be the case. Now that of course is true in the abstract, but if you're making an argument, then the onus of proof lies with the person making the claim. So if you say God exists, then you need to cite evidence and argument as to why you hold that belief. It's not sufficient to say that I can't prove you wrong, so therefore it could be true or it is true. And there's a reason why that is. Firstly, it's canons of evidence. Onus of proof lies with the person making the claim, not with the person to disprove it. Secondly, you can't prove a negative. I use the example of flying reindeer. If you made the claim that reindeers could fly and asked me to prove it wrong, then it won't matter how many reindeers I take to the top of the nearest building and throw off who fall to an untimely death at the bottom of the tower. You could always claim that these reindeers didn't fly, but there are still flying reindeers. And it's all you would need to do is present one flying reindeer in order to prove this argument. But to ask me to prove it in the negative, it won't matter how many reindeers I find that can't fly. You could always claim that I hadn't sampled enough and that therefore there was reindeers that could fly, but I just hadn't found any. Of course, again, you can see then why onus of proof lies with the person making the claim. One we'll have to look at next week, but I thought I'd flag it here, and that's the notion that something is natural. Now, in sociology, we're very suspicious about things being natural. You would have got enough out of the first 5 weeks of lectures to realise that we're suspicious about things that are said to be normal. Who decides what's normal or what the norms are going to be? We're suspicious about arguments from common sense. If somebody says something is common sense, we want to sort of know whose common sense is that. And we're suspicious about that because we have found in the past that this is the way that power relationships are hidden. That it disguises the power of the speaker or under the guise of neutrality. If we accept that it's just common sense, it implies that everybody knows that and therefore it would be silly to oppose it. Or if something is normal, then one shouldn't step outside of that because that's what everybody's doing and we know that that leads to good outcomes. So we're suspicious about that. But another place where that happens is in nature. To claim something is natural. And the reason that nature and natural are such key terms is because they hide power as well. Now I'd encourage you in the next week and in the break to have a look at some uses of the word natural in magazines, and you'll find that it's actually incredibly flexible. You can find natural hair colour. Now one would assume that your natural hair colour is the colour of your hair grows naturally. But it turns out there's all sorts of ways of using natural. So you have natural flavours, natural colours, which are artificial. But here in sociology we're interested in saying nature is used historically to justify inequality. Because if you say it's natural, say that grass is green, then it doesn't make any sense to try to change it. So nature is a very useful way of trying to justify inequality, and there's a historical reason for that. I mean, in the Middle Ages you could justify it because you could say that it was God's law, and people found those arguments convincing, and that the church said it, and they spoke for God, and that the priests said it, and so on. So it was part of the divine order of things that there were kings and peasants and everybody had their place in society, and that was a convincing argument. But in a society that changes as much as ours, those arguments don't hold much water. So you need what has happened historically is that we've looked to science to justify inequality, and the way you do that is by saying, look, it's just natural, there's nothing you can do. And common forms of that are sexism and racism. We see less of this around issues about class, and we're going to talk about this next week, so I don't want to go into too much detail. I just want to flag it that we all know that people make the argument that women are naturally nurturant because they have children. That's a biological argument. They have breasts, they have certain biology that makes them naturally more inclined to be nurturing and caring for children, and that's moving from an is to an ought in philosophy. And to say something is the case, it doesn't follow that it ought to be that way. It's a social construct then to say this is why we have these inequalities that we've talked about in the lecture. It's just natural that women are at home because that's their natural place. We find these arguments were common in circles about racism when race was a scientific category, before Adolf Hitler made it unrespectable. Before the Second World War, it was just understood that people were in different races, and those races predisposed them to different kinds of behaviours and IQ levels, and so of course it was then used to justify the oppression of black people because they were inferior. We could take their land because they were primitives and we were civilised, and so that was just like a survival of the fittest kind of thing. So using a sort of social Darwinist kind of argument. Now a lot of that science also challenges these myths as well. So we don't need to be anti-science. It's a strange kind of institution, science, because anyone who criticises it tends to be labelled anti-science. I mean, it's funny because we don't say that movie critics are anti-movie. Quite the opposite. But I think it's important to understand science as an institution and that it reflects society rather than being above it. Even though it does challenge social norms sometimes, a lot of the time it also reinforces them. Right, so that's it. There were just a few flag things around critical theory and argument, critical thinking and argument that I wanted to share with you, and I'll move on to the next week's lecture. Ta.